For our third session of Covering Rare Diseases Day 4, we'll examine the impact that artificial intelligence is having on rare disease research and treatment development. We are joined by Jineta Banerjee. She is a principal scientist at Sage Bionetworks, which is a nonprofit organization in Seattle that promotes open science and patient engagement in the research process. Her research focuses on exploring creative computational analyses of biomedical data with the goal of accelerating research in rare diseases and encouraging data sharing in the rare disease community. Jineta, thank you so much for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing your analysis of how machine learning can boost innovation in the rare disease space.
Thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful introduction. And I am so honored to be a part of this session today and meeting all of the wonderful folks who are now the fellows in this year. So let me start by sharing my screen. And I'm hoping that everybody can see my slides here. Please give me a heads up if you don't.
We can.
All right, sounds good. Well, good morning to everyone, and I am Jineta Banerjee, as Rachel introduced me already. I'm a principal scientist at Sage Bionetworks, where we implement open science principles to accelerate biomedical research. Now, today I'm going to talk about machine learning and rare disease research, and I'll try and keep this session very informal and interactive, so please jump in with any questions at any time. In the talk today, we'll focus specifically on a few things. First, we'll briefly talk about how rare diseases are present in the headlines today in the newspapers, and then we'll talk a little bit about where we would like to go from here. And then I want to talk briefly about machine learning and artificial intelligence and how they are being used in rare disease research today, and some of the challenges and promises that come along with it. Then we'll take a little bit of a futuristic view and look into the future. And I wanted to bring up three threads of challenges and promises in using machine learning and artificial intelligence in the near future in rare disease, and hope that these can form a good foundation for our discussion today. So let's start with thinking about how rare disease features in the headlines today. So I was just looking through some of the headlines that have come out in the recent times, and I saw three main threads going through the many headlines that came up. So the first thread that I saw was about how governments of various different countries were trying to improve access to affordable and effective therapies for rare diseases. The second thread that came up was how parents or caregivers of rare disease patients were having to turn into patient advocates and activists to make sure that their loved ones receive the kind of care that they need. And then the third thread that I saw also come up quite many times is how there is a big need for new and improved therapies that are scalable in nature and can be accessible by rare disease patients. Now let's take a step back and let our imaginations fly a little bit and see what do we want the headlines to be in the near future. Maybe we want the headlines to be that early diagnosis of rare disease X is now possible. As you might know, some of the rare diseases are so ill understood that sometimes diagnosing those diseases take a long time. So early diagnosis of a disease that was not understood before is a huge step. Maybe another headline could be that new and improved treatments are now available for rare disease Y. And this can be really helpful for rare diseases which have maybe like one or half a treatment available for them, which are not very useful for many of the rare disease patients, because even within a rare disease, there can be a lot of heterogeneity. So more improved treatments would be really helpful. And then maybe another headline could be that FDA or a government organization approves the first drug for rare disease Z, where there were no cures or therapies that existed before. That would be a huge step in providing therapy and care to patients of that rare disease. But we are not there yet. So what can we do to get towards these headlines? Well, we need a lot of molecular, pharmaceutical, and clinical research to really understand many of these diseases and the underlying cellular signaling and disease-related pathways that are causal to these diseases happening in patients. But these aspects of research are very laborious and very time-consuming. For example, testing a hypothesis that a cellular signaling pathway is causative for a rare disease can take years. But in the meantime, what we can do is we can augment these aspects of research into molecular, pharmaceutical, and clinical aspects of the disease with computational methods, where the computational methods can help us sift through large number of candidates of drugs or of potential pathways and choose a few very high confidence pathways that can then be taken into the lab and validated. And this can lead to acceleration of biomedical discovery. And this is where I think traditional machine learning and artificial intelligence can play a really big role. And I want to highlight how I've written traditional machine learning instead of just machine learning. This is just to differentiate between various aspects of machine learning, where some models are more traditional in nature, where there are tasks that are more simplistic. And then there are more sophisticated machine learning algorithms that are coming out now, which we can call artificial intelligence, because they are much more sophisticated. So this is just my way of differentiating between the two. So let's start with thinking about how artificial intelligence or machine learning can help people living with rare diseases. And in thinking about this question, let's focus on two main use cases. One are the patients who need therapies and who need care to really overcome these diseases, or at least live with these diseases in a fruitful manner. And the second use case that we'll talk about is how these methods can help caregivers who are trying to make sure that their loved ones get the care that they need. So first, let's dive into how traditional machine learning has been used or continues to be used in rare disease to help patients. There are many applications where machine learning has been used in rare diseases, but some of the ones that I would highlight in the slides coming next are how these methods can be used for identifying biomarkers or computational markers that can identify or predict whether a patient has a rare disease or not. Another aspect that machine learning has really helped is provide candidates for improved therapeutic targets by sifting through large amount of data from patient samples. So before we dive into too deep into the slides next, let's kind of take a step back and talk about a few definitions of terminologies that will come up over and over again when we talk about machine learning or artificial intelligence. And this is just to make sure that we are aware of the terminologies, and also we are on the same page about what they mean and what we expect when we hear those terminologies. So the first terminology is a traditional machine learning task. So this is a task that a model is trained to perform. And it can be of different kinds, but one of the more popular ones is to identify a disease sample or predict whether a sample has a certain rare disease based on the patterns present in the data provided to the model. The next terminology that comes up right away is features, because these are the things that the model uses to identify those patterns that I just talked about. So these features are individual measurable properties about a certain disease or a patient sample. So for example, if I were to take DNA from a patient sample and sequence it, I would get measurements about 20,000 different genes instantaneously. And these 20,000 different genes, each gene would become a feature of this data set. So when computational folks talk about data, about patients, or about samples, we kind of visualize it as a quadrilateral like this, where the columns are individual features. So each of the columns would be one single gene from the example that I just provided. And then each of the rows are samples or individual data points that we have for all of these features. So the samples are basically individual data points that are obtained from the patients or the tissue taken from the patient. The next terminology that comes up quite regularly is a class or label. And in this case, when machine learning is applied in case of rare disease, it mostly refers to a disease type or a certain kind of outcome that is expected from a patient. So in this schematic right here, this pink and the green are the labels which would determine whether a sample is a rare disease patient or not, given whether it falls within the green or the pink group. The other two terminologies that are very important to keep in mind when thinking about machine learning or artificial intelligence is training data and testing data. So models that are supervised in nature, that is, when the model learns from a data set that is provided to it with the class or labels associated with it, this data helps the model learn the specific patterns in the data set that the model would later use to identify or predict whether a new sample is of a certain class or not. And this data that is used to train the model to identify disease samples is called the training data. Similarly, testing data is new and unseen data points that were not provided during training of a model, but are provided later on to test whether the model does its task well or not. So now that we have all of these definitions in mind, let's go ahead and see how we can think about machine learning in rare disease. Now, machine learning has been around for a long time, but it is only recently that it has become popular in use or in analysis of rare disease data. And that is because applying machine learning in rare disease faces many challenges. There are two main categories of challenges that I'll talk about in the next few slides. One of the challenges is data related, and the other kind of challenge is methodology related. So let's think about the data related challenges in machine learning. Now, in today's world, biomedical data contains many features. For example, as I gave an example before where we sequence DNA from a patient sample, we instantly get measurements of 20,000 genes by one sequencing run. And this is 20,000 features for one sample. That's a lot of features. Now, to detect patterns effectively using all of those features, machine learning algorithms generally need access to many samples, because it's trying to find patterns that come up over and over again for patient samples related to a specific disease. And this is called the curse of dimensionality. So the more number of features we have, the more number of samples are needed for a machine learning model to actually do its job correctly. But as you all know, rare disease, by definition, has few patients or few samples for a specific disease. And I've represented this in a schematic form here, where each of these small rectangles are small rare disease data sets from a few samples. So to make it easier for applying machine learning in rare disease, how can we ensure that we can provide large enough data sets to the models so that they can learn effectively? Well, one way is that we can collect a few different rare disease data sets and then combine them to make one big data set. But we have to be careful here. If we combine these data sets as is, there is a possibility that when a model is applied to these data sets, where we are trying to distinguish between the green and the blue colors, which are related to the disease labels, it might happen that our combination, the way we combine the data sets, was such that the model starts to pick up patterns that are more related to where the data point originated, rather than actual biologically relevant separation between the samples. So what I mean by that is, if we look at the plot over here, we see that the data points kind of segregate by their shape, which is the origin of the data set, rather than the color, which is the actual disease label that we wanted to separate by. So we need to make sure that we are using multiple different steps to combine the data sets in a way that it captures the main or biologically relevant patterns that are required to separate one color from the other, or identify rare disease samples from a host of other samples. And some of these processes are outlined here. So there can be normalization, reprocessing of data, batch correction to make these combined data sets. Another option that we have to make data sets more amenable to, or rare disease data sets more amenable to machine learning applications, is to augment a data set using prior knowledge. Now, let me give an example of what I mean. In 2019, Lee et al. Published a study where they used electronic health record data, and then they wanted to try and use the data in electronic health records to identify rare disease patients from a host of all patients of all kinds of diseases. And the way they did it first is they extracted all the information from electronic health record data, including diagnosis terms, like you see some of the terms here. And then they applied a model to identify which patients were rare disease versus others. What they found is that the accuracy of their model was quite low. So the model was not being able to identify rare disease samples very well. But when they took a different approach, where they augmented their initial data set with something called a knowledge graph, where the meanings of these different terminologies were mapped onto clinical concepts using previously known data or previous knowledge of ours, where we understand what the different terminologies, how they connect with each other, and how they map onto common clinical concepts. They found that the same model could now provide a much better identification of which patients were rare disease patients. So in this case, this data set from the electronic health record was being augmented to help the model understand the data better and pick out the right patterns. Now let's shift gears a little bit and think about what are the methodological challenges that applying machine learning faces in rare disease. So one of the things that I want to highlight here is that applying machine learning models to small data sets like rare disease data sets is quite tricky, because that often leads to the model being either unstable or overfit to the training data. And what I mean by that is a model is unstable when, if you apply the model multiple times to the same data set, it provides completely different outcomes each time. That is a very unstable model. And what I mean by overfit model is that the model performs very well to its training data, so it can identify rare disease patients or samples in their training data, but when presented with a new unseen data set, it completely fails. And this is not a great outcome in the real world scenario, because in the real world, you want the model to be able to identify or predict a sample to be rare disease, even if it has never seen it before. And that is the main use case. So we need to make sure that we have methodological ways or techniques to overcome these, or at least address some of these drawbacks that methodologies of machine learning have in rare disease. So one way to kind of circumvent or at least address this instability is to artificially increase the exposure of the model to rare samples. And this can be done with a technique called bootstrapping. What that does is we can start with a small rare disease data set, and then this technique resamples this small data set and makes a big data set out of the samples that were present in the small data set by sampling over and over again. And we can make one or multiple resampled data sets that are big in nature. Now, if we apply machine learning models to each of these data sets, what we see is that each of the models uses some feature 1 or 2, to identify or to complete its task of identifying a rare disease patient or sample in the data set. And what we instantaneously see is that F1 has a high score, or is being given a lot of importance by this model, but much lesser importance by this model while identifying the same rare disease patients. And this kind of shows the instability of the model that can happen if we do not take this into account early on. Now, if we take this into account early on and use these kind of techniques, then what we can obtain is a distribution of how important the feature is given multiple applications of this model on the same kind of data set. And when we make a distribution, we kind of get a sense of all possible values of this importance score. And this helps us estimate really how important this feature can be for identification of the rare disease samples. Another way that we can kind of help machine learning models to be more stable and work better in when given an unseen sample is with a technique called transfer learning. In this technique, what happens is we take a large data set and apply a model to it to understand or to extract patterns or representations from that large data set, and then use these learnings or these learned representations and apply it to a smaller, much smaller rare disease data set. And this can help identify correlations between the learned representation and the clinical outcome or the clinical label that is present in these rare disease data sets. So it is another way to augment the data set and provide strength to the model to identify patterns that are biologically relevant to identify rare disease samples. But So I talked about a few different methods that can help us address some of the challenges that machine learning faces while in applications of rare disease. But what we have found that sometimes the most effective approach is to combine multiple approaches. And let me give an example of how this would be. So in a study, my collaborator, Jacqueline, was trying to understand a rare disease that affects various different tissue types in the body. And it is extremely challenging to find a single or to build a single machine learning model that can explain patterns for a single disease in different tissue types, because tissue types have their own patterns going on. Like the eye tissue is very different from skin tissue and so on. So what she did is she took a related but completely independent data set, which was really large and contained samples from various different tissue types all together, and then applied various methods like regularization and representation learning to extract these hidden features or hidden representations. And then she used transfer learning to apply these representations onto the much smaller rare disease data sets from the different tissue types. And by combining these various different methodologies, she was able to come up with a model that defines the disease in multiple different tissue types. So the main takeaways that I want to provide here is that whenever we come across biomedical articles that claim that they have applied machine learning and AI models to rare disease, we need to be very vigilant and kind of take note of these questions that I have highlighted here. Were the data sets constructed appropriately so that the machine learning models can fare well in understanding the data set? Were multiple approaches taken to build appropriate models? And were the methods statistically rigorous? So why am I telling you all of this? I think you can really help us get the word out here. So from all the challenges that I mentioned and some of the aspects that I mentioned that can help us overcome those challenges, we need your help to get the word out that there is still a need for well-described data from rare disease patients that were generated with machine learning applications in mind. And what I mean by that is that it kind of addresses some of the data-related challenges that we talked about before. So I want to highlight a little bit of our efforts into making this happen. So at Sage Bionetworks, we work very closely with a rare disease community called neurofibromatosis. And in this community, we have, with active collaboration with the research community, we have put together a data portal called the NF Data Portal. And what this tries to do is that it makes these collections of rare disease data sets that the rare disease research community is generating and makes it available openly to other communities who can help bring machine learning and artificial intelligence methods and use these data to kind of build models and test hypotheses in their own way. And not only do we bring in collections of rare disease data sets and make it available to the larger research community, we have also recently started reprocessing some of the high-value data sets in a standardized manner so that these collections of rare disease data sets can be put together and combined to form these larger data sets, making it more useful for AI/ML applications. So we talked about how data is really needed and is needed more openly for everybody to be able to work on those kind of data. I also want you to help us get the word out for the need for development of methods that can kind of overcome those methodological challenges that I talked about and are tolerant of small sample sizes. And I want to bring up that these kind of methodological advances can not only help the rare disease community, but it can have a much greater implication. What do I mean by that? So when I think about rare disease samples or thinking about generating therapeutic candidates for rare disease patients, I am thinking about coming up with a therapeutic candidate for one person among many, because every rare disease patient is a little bit different and a little bit unique. And this challenge of bringing out therapeutic candidates that are amenable for one person among many is also the same kind of challenge that personalized medicine faces. So I want to emphasize that any methodology that is developed for helping the rare disease community can also be helpful for personalized medicine in the long run. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the caregivers. But before I do that, I wanted to take just a second to see if there were any questions in the room before we go from patients to caregivers. I think we can probably go ahead. So let's, we talked about how machine learning has been used to find biomarkers or candidate therapies for patients. But let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how it can also help caregivers. And what I mean by caregivers is people who are living with a patient who has a rare disease or are parents of children with rare disease. And they could also be primary care physicians who are not experts in the specific rare disease, but are often the first point of contact of the rare disease patient, and sometimes are the ones who help them navigate the healthcare system. And caregivers often find themselves in a position where they have to turn into patient advocates because they need to find ways to make sure that their loved ones are getting the kind of care that they need. So in terms of advocating for the patients that they care for, they need to keep up with research that is ongoing in the disease of interest for these caregivers, for the patients that they have. And to do that, they have to sift through scientific articles, scientific jargon, to really understand what is going on and what is the state of art in their rare disease that they are concerned about. But we must understand that patients or caregivers of rare disease patients may not be scientists themselves. So they may not be used to thinking about scientific data and scientific jargon. So there is a need for simplifying scientific research that can help caregivers understand the disease and really help advocate for their loved ones. And this is where I think the newer artificial intelligence models that have been coming out and have become very popular in the recent times can be really helpful. So a colleague of mine at Sage did this very useful experiment. He used a large language model, ChatGPT really, and asked the model to simplify a scientific abstract and simplify it to a level that it can be read by an 8th grader or a 4th grader. And what we found is that ChatGPT did that very well. It actually, we can see that how the readability score of the original scientific article actually increased as it was simplified by ChatGPT. But so it did a good job in simplifying the words in the scientific article or scientific abstract. But in science, we have to be careful that the simplification doesn't take away the meaning or the content of the scientific abstract. So I asked, is it preserving the meaning of the original abstract that was provided, even though it did a good job of simplifying it? And what I did is we looked at the similarity score of these fourth grade readable abstracts and compared it to the original abstracts that were provided. And we found that the similarity score was actually quite high and significantly higher than if you were to find any other unrelated pair of a fourth grade readable article and an original scientific article. So it looks like these large language models do a good job of preserving meaning while simplifying the research. And this can help enhance the accessibility of research to people who are not scientists themselves. But here we need your help to keep promoting that we need to be vigilant about the drawbacks of large language models. It has already been shown that in some cases, large language models can provide incorrect information. So we need to be very vigilant while using these kind of tools to make sure that we are not falling into the trap of incorrect information. Another thing that we need to keep in mind is that the large language models are being trained on data that is present today with all its drawbacks that are already present. So there are inherent biases in the data where unrepresented populations are not well served by the data. And this leads to propagation of inherent biases even in the models. The models are just as good as the data that were provided to them. So we need to be vigilant towards these inherent biases. So with that, I have talked a little bit about how machine learning and artificial intelligence has been helping in the rare disease community in the present day. But I think there is a pretty exciting time ahead. I think we are at a place where machine learning and artificial intelligence methods are improving by leaps and bounds. And I want to take the next few slides to kind of talk about 3 different threads that I think will become very popular in the next few years and would be really helpful in keeping track of as we think about rare disease. So I'm going to take a pause here to see if there are any questions in the room about everything that I talked about so far, because that was a lot. And I also see there is something in the chat. So I want to...
There is. I was going to ask Eskadar Kifle Lama from Ethiopia to ask her question.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so my question is if that you believe that machine learning and AI will have an influence on making diagnostics and treatments for rare disease or any diseases, to be honest, more affordable for low-income countries. And if so, if you believe that to be true, how far do you think we are from achieving that? Thank you.
That is a really good question. I will try my best to answer that, but I'm not sure I have all of it at my fingertips right now. So I think the machine learning and AI would definitely have an influence on making diagnostics and treatments more affordable. Whether we know that it is already doing some of that in the higher income countries, but how far it percolates to the lower income countries is a really great question that we are still finding out. Given the trends from other kind of diagnostics and treatments that for other diseases that have happened, the more accessibility of the treatments and diagnostics will have a trickle-down effect and will eventually become more popular in the lower income countries. So I think there is going to be that trickle-down effect. But how far we are from that, I think we are still a ways away. We need even in the higher income countries, the treatments for many rare diseases are few and far between. So it will still be some time before we actually see the real tangible effects of AI and machine learning in making these diagnostics and treatments available in the lower income countries. But what I think is going to happen is the accessibility of information about the treatments and information about the rare diseases would potentially become much more accessible now in the next coming years than it was before. Because even in the lower income countries, internet and these kind of large language models the internet is obviously already very pervasive, and these large language models are going to become accessible very soon. So if they are not already, so those kind of easy access to research and easy access to the state of art in rare diseases at this point will be helpful in at least understanding what are the options available, how can we get to those options. I hope that helped answer your question.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have another question myself that's related to that, but I kind of feel like I want to see the rest of your presentation before I ask it. So can we?
Absolutely. So let's charge ahead and see some of these exciting times that I'm thinking about. All right. So the first thing that I want to talk about, which I think is going to be becoming popular very, very soon, if it is not already, I think it is already, is extraction of multimodal data from patients. So what I mean by that, so not too long ago, the healthcare centers that care for patients had access to only one or two modalities of data. For example, they would get clinical records from the patients who have been admitted to their healthcare system, and maybe they had access to some more lab test results and so on from the same patients. But with the advent of technology nowadays, the healthcare centers are much more equipped to collect data that are from various different modalities. For example, they now can ask for sequencing of DNA from the patients, so they can get omics data, genomics, transcriptomics, proteomics. They have clinical notes, access to clinical notes. They have access to laboratory results, maybe some more imaging data, time series data. So all of these kind of data can be now put together to make a more complete picture of the disease, which was not possible before. These improved capabilities of generating these different kinds of data from the same patient kind of make very rich data sets of these patients and can help understanding the disease a lot more. So that's one thing that I'm excited about, that we'll get much more complete pictures of what a rare disease means for a patient in the near future. The next thing that I am excited about is a technology called digital twin technology. So what is digital twin technology? If we think about it, the digital twin technology helps us make a computational model of an entity which is based on data that is collected from real life entities. And what I mean by that is you can make a computational model that reflects data from the real world. This kind of digital, and this computational model would be called a digital twin of the real world entity. And this digital twin technology is actually quite popular in the engineering world. It is already used in the airplane industry, automobile industry, where these digital twins are used to help test technological advances before those advances are released to the general public. So when we think about the digital twin technology in rare disease, I want to emphasize that we are really far away from making a digital twin of a patient. We are nowhere close to that. But what we can start thinking about is making these computational models of much simpler entities like patient-derived cell lines or tissue samples taken from patients, and then use these computational entities to model the disease using all of the multimodal data that can be generated from these tissue samples. We can also take advantage of the new advances in applying differential privacy and privacy-preserving record linkage to make sure that the digital twin technology as applied to patient samples do not violate any privacy implications. And then once we have these kind of computational models that reflect the behavior of patient-derived samples, we can start using these as test beds for optimizing clinical trial design or even preclinical research. So for example, we can computationally test how a certain drug would affect a patient tissue sample even before applying that drug to the patient themselves. But of course, we have to keep in mind, this is still very new in the healthcare field, and we need to overcome many challenges before this becomes a reality. For example, I already mentioned that it is very important to make sure that privacy-related challenges are well understood and well taken care of before releasing any of this into the medical realm. We also need to make sure that when this technology is implemented, it is implemented in an ethical manner. And last but not the least at all is to make sure that the digital twin computational model that we are thinking about and we are making is actually reliable and reliably reflects the behavior that we expect in a real life entity. So with that, I want to go into the third thread that I wanted to touch upon today as the upcoming future in medical field is foundation models. So foundation models are sophisticated artificial intelligence models that can take in data from multiple modalities like text, audio, images, electronic health records, sensor data, omics data, and also bring together existing medical domain knowledge as extracted from literature, publications, knowledge graphs, and clinical notes to make a model that can help healthcare professionals make decisions in real time. We have already seen an example of a foundation model in terms of large language models, but that is very text-based and it does well in some cases, but is not applicable to everything. We think in the next few years, we will see a large improvement in foundation models that can help much bigger applications and would have much flexible interactions. What I mean by that is that these models would be useful for healthcare professionals in making clinical decisions, so help in clinical decision support. But the clinical care provider would not have to use complicated coding mechanisms to interact with these models. These models might have very flexible chatbot-like interfaces where the healthcare provider asks a question about the status of a patient, and the model integrates the clinical information taken from the patient in addition to the domain knowledge that is extracted from the literature and provides an answer to the healthcare professional in a human-readable format. So these models would be highly adaptable in integrating data from different kinds of domains as well as modalities, and would be very flexible in interacting with a healthcare professional. But there are many challenges to overcome here. So we think it is still a little bit of a ways away, but the main challenges that we need to overcome is, again, reliability. We already know from large language models that there is an inherent problem of incorrect information or hallucinations, as they say. So before we talk about foundation models in medicine, we have to make sure that these are reliable when applied to real life. We also need to be very vigilant about the biases. So the models are as good as the data that we provide them. So we need to make sure that no inherent biases are going into the model and affecting the patient outcome.
Jineta, I'm going to jump in simply because we only have about 10 minutes left. Can you tell me how many more slides that you have left?
This is the last slide.
Okay. I apologize for doing that, but I see a question in the chat, and I wanted to make sure that we get as many questions in as possible. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, or was there one more thought that you had that you wanted to leave us with?
I just wanted to make sure that we also think about the privacy preservation challenges when thinking about foundation models in medicine. But with that, I wanted to talk about some of the ways that the fellows can help us in getting the word out. Again, promoting generation of well-described data from underrepresented populations so that we can use these data to train the next generation of models. And we also want to promote vigilance towards protection of privacy in these sophisticated AI applications. And another thing that we want to make sure that everybody remembers, and I want your help to remind everyone every time, is that we want to keep being skeptical of the AI applications and promote fact-checking of AI applications as much as possible so that we can ensure reliability of the models in using these models as tools. So with that, I want to thank all my colleagues at Sage Bionetworks who have made it possible to bring these kind of methodologies to rare disease, work on these methodologies in rare disease. I want to especially thank my collaborators, Casey, Jacqueline, Robert, Deepa, and Justin, who have helped me explore some of these earlier machine learning challenges that we talked about in the first part of the presentation. And then I also want to acknowledge the support of NIH as well as various different foundations who are very active in helping rare disease communities for supporting the research and the work that we do at Sage. So with that, I open the floor to the questions.
Thank you so much for this. I feel as though the journalists once again are getting this very exclusive high-level briefing on this topic. But I saw Santiago's question. Santiago is from Vietnam, and I want him to ask it because I think it brings to mind such an important point.
Hello. Because I think that we are still so far away from really applied machine learning or AI in healthcare field, maybe. So I think that machine learning in this time or in the near future, we can use to provide data to avoid misdiagnosis for low-income countries, like doctors can differentiate between common and rare diseases, because like in Vietnam, most of rare diseases can be treated as common diseases, and when they find the problems, everything is so late. How do you think about this?
Yeah, so this is a great point that you bring up. And I want to highlight that there are two aspects to misdiagnosis. One is just our lack of understanding of the disease. And that kind of lack of understanding comes from not having enough data about the disease or not knowing which pathways are leading to the disease. And I think the traditional machine learning methods that are helpful in finding biomarkers and improved therapeutic candidates can kind of shine a light on that kind of reason for misdiagnosis. So it can provide markers that people can look at to really say that, okay, this disease might fall into this category versus the other. So that's one aspect of misdiagnosis. The other aspect of misdiagnosis, as you mentioned, is just lack of knowledge. Like we just didn't know that these are the symptoms to look at for this kind of diagnosis to happen. And sometimes people don't feel empowered to actually bring forward that they are getting some of these symptoms because they don't know whether it is important or not to bring it up. And this is where I think large language models or machine learning and how it helps understanding of the disease much better can really help out. So in my slides about like caregivers really understanding the research and understanding what are the symptoms that could be related to a certain disease can be a really helpful tool for, first of all, people to bring up those symptoms when they visit their doctors, but also for the doctors to understand that these symptoms are really important for this rare disease, and hence let me refer this individual to a specialist who is in this rare disease. So I agree that the second aspect is definitely something that is going to become much more prevalent in the next few years.
We're so close to running out of time, but I do want Rupsha Chakraborty of the Indian Express to tell us about how AI diagnosis has been playing a pivotal role in TB detection in India.
Yeah, so in the last 10 years, there has been a huge development in using AI in the detection of TB, especially pulmonary TB, because as we know, in rural India, there is a lack of accessibility to healthcare. But as you also highlighted in your presentation, many of the healthcare workers who are not doctors or specialists, they are being trained to use these machines. And in areas in hospitals where there is lack of medical staff, they are using these AI machines for the detection. So just a week ago, the state Indian government declared how in the last 2-3 years they have been able to reduce the TB burden with the help of AI. So I think in future we also have a very important role of AI in detection and early treatment of rare disease. Though it is still in its infancy stage, but it will have a very important role, just like TB.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought that up. And this is a great example of clinical decision support using AI methods.
Our time has come to an end, but I wanted to jump in with a health equity and innovation question. And I've been putting it to several of our other speakers, and that is, we're at this such incredible tipping point or opportunity point in the history of research, particularly genomic and biotech. And when it comes to machine learning and AI, obviously a lot of it depends on data. We've got to have the information in the data sets, got to have the statistics, we've got to have all of this. How much of a detriment or a pull or a drain on this innovation is it when large sectors of populations are left out? When data on the African continent is scarce to come by, when clinical trials only involve certain groups of people and large groups of other people are left out. Is that a valid concern?
That is a very valid concern, and I'm so glad that you bring that up. So as I mentioned, the AI models, even though they seem very fancy, they are as good as the data that they were trained on. And I think this is where there is a huge opportunity to improve how the models will be in the next few years. So any models that are trained with data that is lacking representation from, as you mentioned, African continents or other low-income countries, those models will always be behind on detecting issues that are related to these populations. And that is a very valid concern to have. And I think a lot of the spotlight or coverage goes to the fancy model or the AI method that is being developed. But I want to emphasize that we also need to be very vigilant of the data that is being used for that model. And as Rachel mentioned, that populations that are currently underrepresented in the data that is being used for training these kind of models, we need to shine a light that we need more data from those populations to be included so that the models that are trained and are used in the near future would not have the biases that are inherent in models today. So one way to think about it is, while covering artificial intelligence, let's also cover the data that is used to make those models. And let's promote that data from all different populations be generated equally and be available to the AI researchers equally, so that they can include all of these populations in the models that they build in the near future.
That's a brilliant way to end this conversation. And so I'd like to take this opportunity, Jineta, to thank you so much for joining us for day 4 of Covering Rare Diseases.
Thank you so much. It's my honor to be a part of this. And it was so great to meet all of the fellows this year.